There's a quiet moment most people never notice. It happens right before you look at something. Not while you're looking, not after you've decided what it is, but right before, that split second where your attention hasn't landed yet. Right now, for example, before you really focus on these words, before your eyes settle, there's a strange openness, almost like the scene hasn't fully loaded yet. You've felt this before, you just never named it. You walk into a room and for a fraction of a second it feels empty. Not physically empty, but undefined. Then your attention clicks on and suddenly, the room is there. The furniture, the lighting, the mood, it feels instant, automatic. So fast you assume it was always that way. But what if it wasn't? What if the world you experience doesn't actually arrive until you do? Pause for a second. Notice what your mind wants to do right now. It wants to label this as philosophy, or imagination, or a metaphor. That impulse isn't random. Your brain is trained to protect something very specific. Stability. Not truth, not accuracy. Stability, a world that feels solid, predictable, already decided. Because a world that waits for you. A world that doesn't fully exist until you engage with it. That's unsettling. So let's slow this down. I'm not asking you to believe anything yet. I'm not asking you to agree, just notice. Think about the last time you were scrolling on your phone. You weren't aware of every post. They didn't all exist in your experience, only the one you stopped on. Everything else was just potential. And the moment your attention landed, that post became real to you. Not metaphorically real, experientially real. Your body reacted, your emotions shifted, your thoughts changed direction. The rest might as well not have existed. Now here's the uncomfortable question most people avoid. What if this isn't just how social media works? What if this is how reality itself works? What if your experience of the world is not a passive feed, but something that only becomes definite when your awareness touches it? You might feel a subtle resistance right now, a tightening, a pullback. That's normal. Because if this is true, even a little, then you're not just in reality, you're involved in it. And that challenges something you were taught very early, that the world is already finished, already formed, already there, and you're just moving through it. But think carefully. When you're not thinking about your body, then where is it in your experience? When you're not thinking about a memory, where is it? When you're not looking at an object, what is it doing in your lived reality? We assume continuity because it feels comforting, because it keeps the story clean. But assumption is not the same thing as observation. Here's what makes this moment different. You didn't randomly click this video, something in you sensed that familiar explanation. You're just a person watching a world has started to feel thin, incomplete, like a map that works now but leaves something important out. This isn't about becoming mystical or special or awake in some dramatic way. This is about noticing a crack in the foundation. A small one, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. The crack is this. Your experience of reality seems to activate only when your attention arrives. And if that's true, then attention isn't neutral. Observation isn't passive. And the line between you and what you experience isn't as solid as you were taught. Take a breath. Not because something supernatural is happening, but because your mind is standing at the edge of a different framework. One where reality isn't something you simply walk through. It's something that responds. not to your wishes, not to your thoughts, but to your presence. In the next part, we're going to talk about why your brain resists this idea so strongly, and why that resistance isn't a flaw. It's a sign that something deeper is being touched. For now, just sit with this. What if the world isn't fully formed until you arrive to meet it? And what if that changes everything? If you felt a slight tension at the end of the last part, that wasn't confusion. That was protection. Your brain just detected a threat, not a physical one, not an emotional one, a structural one. Because the idea you just brushed up against doesn't simply add information. It challenges the framework your mind has been using to organize reality itself. And the brain does not like that. Here's something most people never learn. Your brain's primary job is not to understand reality accurately. Its job is to keep you oriented, functional, and alive. Accuracy is optional, stability is not. That's why humans believed the sun revolved around the earth for centuries. That worldview worked well enough. It felt stable, predictable, centered. And when evidence appeared that contradicted it, people didn't celebrate. They resisted. They mocked. They punished the messengers, not because the new idea was wrong, but because it destabilized the mental ground they were standing on. What you're encountering now triggers the same mechanism. Your mind senses that if this idea goes any further, some long-held assumptions may no longer hold. So it deploys defenses, subtle ones. It might whisper, "This is interesting but not practical." Or, "This sounds like philosophy, not real life." Or even, "Okay, but I still have bills to pay." Those thoughts aren't objections, they're escape hatches. Your brain is trying to keep its existing structure intact. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The moment your mind genuinely understands something that cannot fit inside its current model of reality, it has only two options. It can reject the information, or it can reorganize itself. And reorganization is expensive, neurologically, energetically, existentially. Think of your worldview like a house you've lived in your whole life. You know where everything is. You know which floorboards creak. You know which doors stick. Now imagine discovering that the foundation is slightly off, not collapsing, not broken, just inaccurate. Fixing that doesn't mean repainting a wall, it means lifting the house while you're still living inside it. That's what your brain is trying to avoid. This is why people can study quantum mechanics for years and still keep their everyday sense of reality untouched. They compartmentalize. They let the weirdness stay in textbooks, laboratories, chalkboards. As long as it doesn't touch them, as long as it doesn't question the feeling of being a separate self moving through a solid, pre-existing world. Because once that boundary starts to blur, the brain loses its favorite anchor point. And when that anchor loosens, something unsettling happens. Certainty fades, not just about physics, but about identity, about continuity, about control. You might notice this already. A quiet question forming underneath your thoughts. If reality isn't as fixed as I assumed, then what exactly am I standing on? That question feels dangerous, so the brain rushes to answer it quickly, usually with familiar language. Don't overthink this. Just be practical. None of this really changes anything. But notice something. Those responses don't actually address the idea, they just try to shut the door. Here's why. Your sense of being you, a solid observer inside a body looking out at a world. That sense is not just philosophical. It's neurological. Your brain has spent your entire life wiring itself around the assumption that you are here. Reality is out there, and the two are separate. That assumption organizes perception, memory, decision-making, emotion. So when information appears suggesting that observation itself might be part of how reality becomes definite, the brain doesn't treat it as a concept, it treats it as a threat to identity, and that's where the resistance comes from. Not fear of being wrong, fear of losing orientation. But here's the part no one tells you. Resistance doesn't mean something is false. It usually means something is important. The brain resists what forces it to change, not what merely adds decoration. Right now, nothing is required of you. You don't need to accept anything. You don't need to agree. Just recognize this. The discomfort you feel is not a mistake. It's a signal, a sign that you're brushing against a truth that doesn't fit neatly into the old container. And that container is starting to creak. In the next part, we're going to look directly at the question your brain is avoiding. What is reality before you observe it? Not philosophically, not poetically, but experientially, because once you see that clearly, the resistance won't disappear. But it will make sense. And when resistance makes sense, it stops controlling the direction you move. Stay with it. You're not losing your footing, you're noticing the ground for the first time. Let's approach this gently. Because the question we're about to ask is one your mind has been trained not to linger on. What exists before you observe it? Not in theory, not in science class, but in your direct experience. Right now, look around the room you're in, notice how clear it feels, defined, solid. Now close your eyes. The room doesn't disappear, does it? But something important changes. It no longer exists as an experience. There's no color, no shape, no distance. You might think about the room, but thinking is not the same as seeing. Thought is memory, expectation, imagination. Experience is something else. With your eyes closed, the room becomes vague, not gone, but unformed, a kind of not yet. Now here's the subtle move. Before you open your eyes, pause. Just for a moment. In that pause, notice this. You don't actually know what you're about to see. You assume, you predict, you expect, but you don't know. There's a brief window where the scene ahead exists as possibility rather than certainty. Now open your eyes. Notice how quickly the uncertainty collapses. Instantly, the room becomes this room, not any other version. This specific lighting, this angle, this configuration. It feels so immediate that you assume it was always that way. But your experience tells a different story. There was a moment, however small, where it wasn't yet defined. Most people skip over that moment. Their attention jumps straight to the result. But if you slow down enough, you can feel it. That soft edge between not yet and now it is. This isn't imagination, this is structure. The structure of how experience forms. We've been taught that reality is a finished product and perception is just a camera. But your own experience contradicts that. A camera records what's already there. Your awareness doesn't work like that. It activates, it selects, it brings something from vague to definite. Think about sound. When the room is quiet, you're not hearing everything at once. The hum of electricity, the distant traffic, the subtle movement of air, most of it doesn't exist for you. Then a sound catches your attention. And suddenly it's there. Sharp, present. What changed? Not the sound itself. Your attention did. And the moment it arrived, that sound entered reality. Your reality. The same is true for sensation, for emotion, for meaning, for objects. You're not flooded with the entire world at once. You experience a selected collapse, a narrowing from many possibilities into one lived moment. This is where language starts to fail us, because we want to say the room existed, I just wasn't aware of it. And maybe in some abstract sense it did. But abstraction is not experience. In your lived reality, what you don't observe is not fully there. It's latent, potential, waiting. Now here's the part your brain really doesn't like. If this is true for rooms and sounds and sensations, why wouldn't it be true for everything else? Why wouldn't the world itself exist in a kind of unfinished state until it meets observation? This is where people usually pull back. They say, that can't be right. The world doesn't depend on me. And that reaction is understandable, because this isn't about ego. It's about responsibility. If experience becomes definite when you observe it, then observation matters. And if observation matters, then you are not just a witness, you're part of the process. But let's be precise. This doesn't mean you invent reality out of nothing. It means reality as you experience it emerges from a field of possibilities when awareness engages. Think of it like this. Before a song is played, the file exists as data, not sound, not music, just encoded potential. Press play and suddenly there's melody, emotion, rhythm. Did you create the song? No. But without the act of playing it, there is no music in the room. Reality behaves more like that than we were taught. It's not a static object, it's a dynamic process. And awareness is the play button. Your mind wants to argue with this. It wants to say, that's just how attention works, But notice something. Attention doesn't just highlight experience, it completes it. Before attention, there is uncertainty. After attention, there is form. This isn't mystical. It's observable. You've just never been asked to look at it this way. And once you do, a quiet realization begins to form. You are not moving through a pre-built world like a tourist walking through a city. You are participating in how the city appears to you moment by moment. That doesn't make you powerful. It makes you involved, and involvement changes everything. Because if reality, as experienced, is not fully formed until it meets awareness, then the boundary between you and what you experience is already thinner than you thought. In the next part, we're going to say the truth that this realization has been circling around, not vaguely, not indirectly, clearly, and once it's stated plainly, your mind won't be able to pretend it didn't hear it. That's where things really start to shift. Stay with me. You're doing better than you think. Up until now, we've been circling something, feeling its shape, not naming it, because once it's said plainly, it can't be unheard. So let's take one more breath, not to prepare for something dramatic, but to slow the mind enough to hear what's actually being said. Here is the truth, stated directly. You are not a passive observer watching a finished reality unfold. You are an active participant in how reality becomes definite through observation. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, experientially. Every moment you experience what you see, what you hear, what feels real right now, is the result of a process where possibility collapses into form when awareness engages. This isn't about positive thinking. It's not about visualization. It's not about manifesting what you want. Those are surface interpretations. This is deeper. It's about how experience itself comes into existence. Before you observe, there isn't one fixed version of what will be experienced. There is a range, a field of potential outcomes, and when observation happens, when awareness makes contact, one version becomes this moment. That's what you're living inside of. A continuous series of collapses from possibility into experience. Your mind wants to interrupt right now. It wants to say, "So are you saying I create everything?" No, that's not what this means. You don't author reality alone. You don't control every variable. You don't dictate outcomes at will. But you are not separate from the process either. You are participating in it. Think of it this way. Reality is not a solid object. It's more like a probability landscape, a terrain of potential experiences. Observation doesn't invent the terrain sim, but it determines which path becomes the one you're walking. And here's where things get uncomfortable, because you were taught a very specific story growing up, that you are a subject inside a body looking out at objects in an external world. That story feels obvious, intuitive, common sense. But common sense is not evidence, it's habit. And when you look closely at your own experience, that story starts to crack. Because you never actually experience an objective world out there. You experience sensations, perceptions, interpretations, all of which appear in awareness. And they only appear when awareness is present. This doesn't mean the world disappears when you look away. It means definiteness disappears. What's left is potential, unselected, uncollapsed, waiting for engagement. Here's a simple way to feel this. Right now you have countless sensations available. Pressure where your body meets the chair, the temperature of the air, subtle sounds you weren't noticing. They weren't gone. They just weren't realized. The moment you attend to one, it becomes vivid, clear, defined. That's collapse. And it's happening constantly. Your brain wants to reduce this to psychology. But psychology alone doesn't explain why experience feels incomplete until attention arrives. Why the world sharpens when you look. Why meaning forms when you notice. Why a moment feels unreal until it's acknowledged. This is where modern physics quietly agrees with what your experience has always hinted at. At the most fundamental level, systems don't exist in a single definite state until interaction occurs. Before interaction, there are probabilities. After interaction, there is outcome. Observation is not neutral, it's a factor, and when the system being observed is the one you live inside of, when the system includes your body, your senses, your environment, then observation isn't just something you do, it's something you are. This is the line where the old worldview fails, because the old worldview says, I am here, reality is there, and I watch it. But your experience says something different. It says, I am here. Reality shows up with me. That difference may sound small. It isn't. It changes the role you thought you were playing. You are not a spectator in a completed film. You are part of the mechanism that determines which frame appears next. Again. Not consciously, not perfectly, not alone, but undeniably. This doesn't inflate the ego, it dissolves it, because the you that wants control is not the same thing as the awareness that observes. What you call me is not a solid entity directing reality. It's a pattern inside the same field that's being observed. The observer and the observed are not two separate things interacting. They are two aspects of one process. That's why this truth feels destabilizing, because it removes the clean boundary, no longer me looking at world. but experience arising through engagement between awareness and possibility. You can feel your mind reaching for ground, something firm, something fixed. That's normal. Because this truth doesn't give you a new solid belief to stand on. It removes one, and in its place it offers something less comfortable but more accurate. Participation. You are not trapped in a predetermined reality. But you are not omnipotent either. You are participating in an unfolding process where your presence matters, your attention matters, your orientation matters. Not because you create everything, but because experience does not finalize without observation. This is why your experience of life changes when your way of looking changes, not because the world magically rearranges itself, but because a different version of the probability field is being realized. Once this lands, really lands, you can't go back to believing you're just watching. Because you've seen the seam. You've felt the moment where uncertainty becomes form. And that means the old story no longer fully explains your life. In the next part, we're going to talk about the resistance that rises after this realization. Not before, after. The patterns the mind uses to pull you back into the old role. Not because it's right, but because it's familiar, and once you see those patterns clearly, they lose much of their power. Stay with this. You're not being asked to adopt a belief. You're being invited to recognize a process that has been happening your entire life. You just finally noticed it. Once this truth begins to land, something interesting happens. The resistance doesn't disappear. It changes strategy. Earlier, the mind tried to stop you from hearing this at all. Now that it's heard, now that something has clicked, the mind tries something else. It tries to regain control, not aggressively, not obviously, quietly. Because the ego isn't stupid, it doesn't argue head-on with what you've clearly seen. It works around it. It reframes, it minimizes, it redirects. So let's slow this down and name what's actually happening. Not to fight it, not to get rid of it, just to see it clearly. Because once you see these patterns, they lose their ability to run the show unconsciously. Pattern 1. Intellectual dismissal. This one sounds reasonable. It says, okay, interesting idea, but this is just one interpretation. Or, people debate this stuff, nothing is proven. Notice what this does. It turns a lived realization into an abstract debate. It moves the experience out of your body and into an argument. But here's the quiet trick. You didn't arrive here through belief. You arrived through noticing, through experience, the moment before you looked, the moment uncertainty became form. No interpretation is required to see that. Debate is useful when you're guessing, less useful when you're observing. The ego prefers argument because argument delays integration. Pattern 2. Containment. This one says, sure, maybe this applies to physics, but not to everyday life. It tries to keep the truth in a small sealed box, a laboratory, a textbook, a theory, far away from your identity, far away from how you live. But notice the contradiction. Your life is not made of everyday matter, separate from physics. Your body is not exempt. Your senses are not exempt. Your brain is not exempt. Whatever rules reality follows, your experience follows them too. Containment isn't logic, it's quarantine. The ego is trying to isolate the truth so it doesn't infect the rest of the worldview. Pattern 3. Existential panic. This one feels heavier. It asks, so if observation matters, and does that mean I'm alone? Does that mean other people aren't real? This fear feels profound, but it's based on a misunderstanding. Participation does not mean isolation. You are not the only point of awareness in the field. You are one node among many. Reality is not being collapsed by you alone, but through countless interacting perspectives. That's why the world feels shared, consistent, correlated. Not because it's fixed independently, but because observation is distributed. The ego panics here because it confuses participation with solipsism. But those are not the same thing. Pattern 4. Responsibility avoidance. This one sounds like relief. It says, if observation affects reality, then does that mean everything bad is my fault? So the ego pulls back, hard, because blame feels dangerous. But notice the exaggeration. Participation is not total control. Most of what collapses into experience does so unconsciously, shaped by biology, by history, by collective patterns, by probability itself. This truth doesn't make you guilty, it makes you less powerless. There's a difference. You are not the author of everything that happens, but you are not merely a victim either. The ego prefers victimhood over nuanced responsibility, because victimhood feels simpler. Pattern 5. Addiction to certainty. This is the deepest one. It doesn't argue, it aches. It says, if nothing is fixed, what can I trust? This is where the old foundation dissolves, the idea that the past is solid, that the future is determined, that the self is stable. When those certainties loosen, the mind feels exposed, ungrounded, and it wants to rush back to something familiar. Even if it's false, here's the paradox: certainty feels safe. But certainty built on false assumptions creates long-term suffering. Uncertainty feels destabilizing. But uncertainty aligned with truth allows growth. The ego clings to certainty because certainty keeps identity intact, even when identity is outdated. Now pause for a moment. Notice if you felt any of these patterns while listening. Not all of them. Just one is enough. That recognition is important, because it means the process is working. You are not doing this wrong. You are encountering the exact friction that appears when understanding goes deeper than belief. The ego is not your enemy. It's a protective structure built around an older map of reality. It's trying to preserve orientation. You don't need to destroy it, you just need to stop letting it pretend it's the truth. In the next part, we're going to shift out of explanation entirely. No more theory, no more framing. We're going to move into direct experience. Simple practices that let you feel this process happening. Not as an idea, but as something alive in your perception. Because once experience confirms what you've heard, the mind relaxes. It no longer needs to defend against understanding. Stay with it. You're not losing control. You're learning where control never actually was. Up to this point, your mind has been doing most of the work. Listening, connecting ideas, evaluating, that's natural. But understanding doesn't fully settle until it moves out of thought and into experience. So for this part, we're going to stop explaining and start noticing. Nothing dramatic, nothing mystical. Just simple shifts in attention that reveal what's already happening. Let's begin with something very small. Practice 1. The moment before. Wherever you are right now, don't change anything. Just soften your focus. In a moment, you're going to look at something nearby. But before you do, pause. Notice that brief space right before your eyes land. That moment where you haven't yet selected what you're seeing. There's a quiet openness there, a not knowing. Now let your attention move. Notice how quickly that openness collapses into something definite. Color, shape, form. The world snaps into place. You didn't create the object, but you did complete the experience. That transition from undefined to defined is not imagination. It's structure, and it happens constantly. You just rarely notice it. Practice 2. Changing the observation. Now look at the same scene again, but this time observe it differently. First, look for something neutral. Just shapes, lines, geometry. Then look again. This time noticing anything pleasant. Light, balance, texture. Then look once more. And notice anything that feels uncomfortable, cluttered, or tense. Same scene, different observation, different experienced reality, nothing external changed. But what you lived did. This is not about positivity. It's about participation. Observation doesn't just reveal. It selects, it emphasizes, it brings certain aspects forward while leaving others latent. That's collapse in action. Practice 3. Before a choice. Think of a simple decision you've made recently. What to say, where to go, what to click. Now imagine the moment right before you chose. There was more than one option, a sense of openness, multiple possible outcomes. Then the choice happened, and one path became real. The others didn't disappear abstractly. They simply didn't manifest. You experience life as a sequence of choices collapsing possibility into actuality, not because you control everything, but because experience itself moves this way. Practice 4. Observing the observer. Now let's turn attention inward, not to think about yourself, but to notice the act of noticing. Right now you're aware of these words, of your body, of the space around you. Instead of focusing on what you're aware of, gently notice that awareness is happening. There's a presence that doesn't have shape or size. It doesn't feel like an object. It feels like openness. This is important, because what you call you is usually identified with thoughts, emotions, and sensations, but those are things being observed. The observer itself is quieter, less defined. And when awareness meets experience, experience becomes definite. That's the mechanism. Not mystical. Functional. Practice 5. Intention without force. Now let's clarify something. Participation doesn't mean forcing outcomes. It means influencing probabilities. Before your next interaction today, a conversation, a task, a walk, pause for a moment, not to demand a result, just to orient observation. Maybe you choose to notice clarity, or ease, or connection. Then let the moment unfold. Don't strain, just observe. Later reflect. Not on whether you got what you wanted, but on how experience felt different than it usually does. This is how participation shows itself. Subtle, incremental, real. Now pause. Notice how your body feels after these practices. Not euphoric, not special, just slightly more present. That's important, because integration doesn't announce itself loudly. It feels like familiarity, like something quietly clicking into place. Here's what's happening beneath the surface. Your brain is beginning to register that this isn't just an idea, it's a pattern it can verify. Over time, as these observations repeat, new neural pathways strengthen, old assumptions loosen, not through force, but through recognition. This is how reorganization happens, naturally, gradually, without drama. You're not trying to stay in a special state. You're learning to notice what has always been operating. And when awareness aligns with how reality actually behaves, resistance fades. Not because you pushed it away, but because it's no longer needed. In the final part, we're going to talk about what often comes next, the period of uncertainty, the feeling of losing solid ground before a new stability forms, not as a warning, but as reassurance. Because if that phase appears, it doesn't mean something is wrong. It means reorganization is underway. Stay with it. Nothing is breaking. Something is recalibrating. There's a phase that often comes next. Not for everyone, not in the same way, but often enough that it deserves to be named. It's the moment when the old certainty no longer works, and the new one hasn't fully formed yet. You might feel it as a kind of quiet disorientation, not panic, not fear. More like the ground you used to stand on doesn't feel as solid as it did before. Things you never questioned start to feel less obvious. Who you are, how the world works, what can be trusted. This isn't a crisis, it's a transition. Your brain spent years, maybe decades, organizing itself around one assumption, that you are a separate self moving through a fixed world. Once that assumption loosens, everything built on it wobbles for a while, not because it was useless, but because it was incomplete. And when a structure reorganizes, there's always a moment where it hasn't settled yet. This is the part most people misinterpret. They think something is going wrong. They try to rush back to old explanations, old beliefs, old certainty. But here's the truth. That temporary uncertainty is not a sign of losing your grip on reality. It's a sign that your understanding is becoming more accurate. Certainty based on a false foundation feels stable, until it quietly limits your life. Uncertainty aligned with truth feels uncomfortable, but it opens space, and space is where new structure forms. What eventually emerges is not chaos, it's a different kind of stability. One that doesn't depend on pretending the world is fixed. You begin to notice something subtle. You still function, you still plan, you still live your life. But underneath it all, there's a new awareness, a recognition that experience is not happening to you, it's happening with you. You stop seeing yourself as a passive character in a predetermined story. And you don't swing to the opposite extreme either. You don't believe you control everything. Instead, something more honest appears. Participation. You notice that how you observe shapes what you experience, that where your attention rests changes what becomes real for you. Not magically, not instantly, but consistently. You relate to circumstances differently, not as enemies, not as fate, but as outcomes emerging from complex probability that you are part of. And that changes how you move through the world. You become less reactive, less rigid, more responsive, more curious, not because you're awake or enlightened, but because your mind is no longer clinging to an outdated map. This is what a reset actually is. Not forgetting who you are, not becoming someone else, but reorganizing around a clearer understanding of how experience forms. Once this shift happens, you can't fully return to the old story. You might temporarily think in old ways, react in familiar patterns. But somewhere in you there's now a quiet knowing. That reality is not something you're merely surviving. You are engaged in it, moment by moment, observation by observation. That knowing doesn't shout, it doesn't demand belief. It simply stays. And over time, it changes how you choose, how you interpret, how you respond. Not because you force it, but because seeing clearly naturally changes behavior. So if something in you feels subtly different right now, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just slightly reoriented, that's not imagination. That's integration beginning. You don't need to rush it. You don't need to explain it. Just notice when the old reflex tries to take over. And gently remember, you're not a separate observer watching a finished reality unfold. You're participating consciousness, meeting possibility, and bringing experience into form. That's not a belief. It's something you can notice every time you arrive. If this resonated, not as an idea but as recognition, you already know. And if you want to mark this moment, not as a promise for the future but as acknowledgement of a shift already underway, you can simply hold this sentence quietly. I'm noticing how reality responds to how I observe. That's enough. Nothing else is required. Welcome back to a world that was never separate from you.